So this is the OpenChain AI work group, our first meeting of the year. The purpose of this work group, newly enabled and converted from a study group, is to do something actionable in the field of AI in the context of what the OpenChain project does. OpenChain, for any of you who are not familiar, I'm thinking particularly those watching this recording. OpenChain focuses on open source process management. And our general optic is types of compliance, most famously license compliance, but also more recently matters related to security compliance or security assurance. And obviously, when we look at AI, that means that we're looking at some form of AI compliance. And our focus has been and always will be on building a trusted supply chain. So this work group is working on a practical outcome for a trusted supply chain related to AI compliance. Before we get started, we have the antitrust policy notice as always. The full Linux Foundation antitrust policy can be found on the website. And if you're from a member company, you can ask any questions of our counsel, Andy of De Grove. Now, if you're not from a Linux Foundation member company and you've got any questions about antitrust policies, do check it out with your own counsel. The short version is that it helps us all collaborate in a comfortable and convenient manner. Now, I see that we have quite a few of our very active participants, including our co-chair, Matthew Crawford online. Jeff Kettle, Brian Adams have been particularly active in helping to drive the conversation last year. Of course, we mustn't um, minimize the fact that everyone on this call has been part of this and pushed things forward. Matthew, with your permission, could I run through quick context on what we've been up to before handing over to you for the editing bit and
Please do.
the guest speaker bit? Right. Agenda, four parts to the workshop. First part is the editing part. The job of this work group, the fundamental job, is working on a draft guide to AI compliance bill of materials for the supply chain. If you're new, good news, it's at least 60% done. We have been working on this for a year. There's a document ready, and that will be live edited on this call. This is significant because as a work group, this document, when ready, will go back up towards the governing board, and with their approval, will become an official OpenChain resource. At that point, it will be promoted widely across the entire open source ecosystem as a guide to AI compliance. This joins other things like our Telco SBOM quality guide, the forthcoming evolution of that into a multi-industry, multi-format SBOM quality guide, and previous activities. For example, we did a guide to security assurance in the supply chain, and that later evolved into the ISO standard, ISO 18974. What that means is what we do is meaningful here, and it will be exciting. Then we'll have a guest speaker, and we'll have a space after that for any other business before closing the meeting. Jumping right in to the editing of the guide, and I'm just going to copy paste this text into the chat for everyone's convenience on the line. There is a Google Doc open with the current version of the draft guide. There are some open comments on it, and I believe that one of the priorities of this workshop will be to close those comments and do things like double check formatting. Does everything look easily readable? Will people be able to work on this? Today's workshop and the section on this guide is part one of what's probably six parts that we'll be going through in the next few months. Part one, initial editing, changing the study group's notes on a potential guide into a solid looking draft guide. Then we give it to the governing board. They meet in 2 weeks or so they can have a look at it and provide any early feedback. Next workshop, second editing cycle, including feedback from them and anyone not on this call. Third editing cycle around March. And hopefully then it's ready for wide distribution across the OpenChain ecosystem in a call for comments, and around April being kicked up to the board for a more, if not totally final, kind of final review, as it hopefully is ready or almost ready for publication. With that, I'm just going to stress that everyone on this call, experienced or not, is part of the ecosystem. They're all stakeholders. You are all stakeholders in what we're doing. So jump in with comments, ideas, and questions at any time. Our ISO standards were built by you. Our guides, our reference material, by you. We reflect what is on the mind of the people who turn up to try to build a trusted supply chain. No matter what the experience level, we want to include your thoughts. Right, with that, I'll hand over to you, Matthew. My abrupt handover may have caught Matthew
No,
by surprise. No,
don't worry about
I
it. I'm
was
here. I'm here.
I was hopeful I had successfully derailed you. No,
No, I'm
fine.
here, Shane. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you for preparing the slides as well. I'll share my screen in a moment, and we have that working group. I will just add that Brian Warner from Cisco will be joining us at the top of the next hour to give a talk on sort of his thoughts around AI and AI bomb compliance. Dave and I and others met him in the Linux Foundation Membership Summit last year, and he gave a really good talk that I'd like to share with this group so we can add to the good work that is being done. So I will share my screen, and I have the OpenChain Working Group Bill of Materials Management Guide. If someone can just confirm that they can see my screen.
Yes, it's displaying well. The only challenge might be that it's a very big screen, but yes, exactly. Zooming in on the document, looking good.
Is this better?
Much better.
Thank you. So at the end of the last meeting in December, we had this guide, and there were a number of comments that were made last time. I've kind of reviewed them and kind of just edited them. Lots were just sort of small tweaks that, having discussed, I think it was reasonable for us to update. Of course, anything can still be amended until this ratified. There were a couple of sort of slightly larger topics that I just wanted to bring back so we can make sure we've got the right flavor of the wording as we go through. For those who are new to this, this AI compliance bill of material management guide was built off some standards that OpenChain had worked on in 2020, mainly the license standard, but also we've reviewed a few other ISO standards before this meeting. So we've talked about 42001, about AI management systems, and we had our learned colleagues from SPDX to come and talk about SPDX. I noticed something in the chat. Thank you for sharing that document again. Okay, so this was the guide. As I said, I've tidied it up. There's a few points. Please, please, please chip in, jump in, challenge, ask questions. It was great that so many comments were added after the last meeting and during the last meeting, but let's keep going until we've had enough. And as Shane said, we can then present it to the board when we are ready. So the first section is around policy. There weren't any particular comments around there. We state that we should have a document policy for AI compliance. Anyone have any comments, please feel free to interrupt me. The next section was around competence to ensure that the organization identifies corresponding roles and responsibilities for people working in a program. Again, we talked about this last time. We stated in the verification materials that documented evidence of the assessed competence for each project participant should be done, but we said, well, we should keep that list up to date with periodic checks. Someone was suggesting 3 months. I think just periodic checks probably seems reasonable depending on what type of project it is, just to make sure that that list is kept up to date. So we have competent people working on AI and AI bill of materials. Moving on, a company should have a number of different policies and objectives, so people are aware of what they have. So they'll have a AI bond policy, relevant AI objectives, contributions and effectiveness of the program, and the implications of not following program's requirements. People should be made well aware of that, and this corresponds with the licensing standard. I think we were all fairly in agreement with that, and there weren't many changes there. Program scope, so different programs may be governed by different levels of scope. For example, a program could govern a single product line, an entire department, or an entire organization. So we should have a written statement that clearly defines what a program is in its context. Again, there were no concerns there. Now moving on to the sort of slightly more chunky guide, chapters, paragraphs, was around licensing obligations. I kind of wanted to talk about this in a little more detail. So we state that we should have a process shall exist for reviewing the identified licenses from models data sets, including but not limited to training, testing, verification data sets, as well as the model and system itself, to determine obligations, restrictions, and rights granted by each license. There should be a process in place to identify and review license obligations. So that paragraph has changed a lot since last time, with a lot more sort of adverbs, identify and review, added into the system. I will pause here for comments from people to see if anyone has any concerns or wants to add anything to that. Hearing none, we go to then the thing that was outstanding here. So Nick mentioned last time from fastcatalog.ai, one small caveat is that obligations of a license of an upstream model or dataset may or may not apply to the downstream AI model trained on them. The language seems to assume they may, or that the AI model trainer must take a position on whether they do. Perhaps simplifying documenting for transparency purposes may be sufficient in the first step. Should we describe variations as obligations based on how the model is used without modification and how private model is derived from an open source model? Documented procedures to review and document the identified licenses. And then Jimmy talks about, in this context, it seems important to also highlight that some data sets may have unclear licenses or unknown, such thus it is documented in procedures how to work on those. So we have a very sort of basic sort of wording here, and would appreciate people's thoughts and comments based on what was said last time.
Just a quick note that having editions that are short and compact and stay on message like this look like a viable option. The only caution is to avoid expanding too much from where we are currently, but this comment doesn't look like it would be doing that at all. So it seems reasonable as a suggestion.
Yeah, I agree. The idea that in the course of doing the upstream diligence, one needs to take a conclusion, reach a conclusion on whether or not certain terms apply to, let's say, downstream folks. That's I feel like that's a fundamental principle of basic software licensing. Not that the questions are basic, but that the requirement is fundamental. By the way, it does seem like it's. So I agree with Nick's comment there that that does seem to be a implicit requirement, because I don't know how else we make a reduce friction supply chain unless people downstream understand what obligations are being passed down. And if anyone wants to point out the fact that there's right now there's some flux within the interpretive system, within the legal realm, I take that good point, because that's the way that you might draw conclusions here, and how, let's say, copyrightability might be either amplified or diminished based on how the courts might land on those issues. That'll have an implication as to pragmatically how people behave under this. But nevertheless, I would say that people downstream will not be in a better position to be able to draw conclusions. It needs to be the people upstream that will be taking that position, I think. Let me know if that makes sense to anyone. If people have any questions about that. There's room for reasonable minds to differ, certainly.
To your point, Dave, about the copyright ability still being worked out or processing through the courts, I think the wording that we have at the moment would be agnostic to a result either way.
Yeah, I agree. I agree that the wording, there is fine. I just wanted to address what, folks, seem to say that is implicit there. And I agree with that, And by the way, Matthew, if you can characterize my point a little bit more about the obligations needs to be identified at the upstream location so that they can be passed downstream. I was trying to express that. Thanks.
I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. I think we'll talk about this meteor issue later on in the call or our next meeting, but it looks like the scope of this requirement is to document the procedure, not necessarily to pass along any of these obligations, restrictions, and rights. So I think that limited scope makes sense given everyone's comments. But I do think that we're going to have a little bit more of a discussion about passing along the obligations, restrictions, and rights, because that kind of gets into more analysis and more conclusory thinking.
Yeah, agree.
Do we want to capture that, though, in these sort of guidelines of who would necessarily own those rights? I'm just thinking whether that would be down to the organizational level. And do we then just capture, a process shall exist or a conversation shall exist to determine who owns the rights, but we don't fully specify who owns the rights to that? I'm making myself clear.
Yeah. There's a bunch of ongoing work streams that might have implications to that. One is this thing that's happening in the US, sorry, not the US, in the EU with the code of practice conversations. And there's this working group called, the copyright/transparency working group, where they've split out transparency into a separate thing. And in the transparency working group, they're trying to figure out the juncture for disclosure of training data sets. Included in that would be the meta information from those data sets that would pull in also information about the rights holders. Rights holders as represented in the metadata information, not necessarily, saying, getting back to the root, let's say, this is someone that this is Dave Moore posts something to his Facebook account, in 2010. And if that kind of scraping wasn't, so it wouldn't be Dave Moore, but it would probably be more like, it'd be Facebook information, whether that's correct or not, just by way of example. But that kind of meta information would be included within that transparency piece. And whether or not that's disclosed to people actually downstream in the supply chain is still open to question. Right now, I think they're talking about disclosure to European Commission authorities on demand. So, so that kind of information, being prepared, that's and how they might land on those issues might pragmatically inform how we end up seeing these provisions interpreted. But we're going to stay at the procedural level, as Brian indicated.
We have talked about transparency before and kind of touched on it's kind of too much of an unknown for us to kind of start to capture at the moment. Do you know more about that transparency group, Dave, of when they are going to release anything? Because we're now, 12 months on from starting this document. We could be in a position to capture certain things here to say, to the extent of the law, we would be transparent for whatever's needed, to regulators, to the EU regulators you just highlighted.
Yeah. That again, so they're talking about data set transparency, training data set transparency in that context, but they are trying to target for May, and it's an open question whether or not that'll actually be ready with a sort of like a robust final product, because they're pressing on the timeline pretty aggressively.
And do we have members of that working group in this group, or could we invite them along to discuss what they're proposing? Do you have any contacts?
Lori just got added to the next session, so it's probably too early to. And they're quite particular about how many people attend certain sessions. So, but maybe, I don't know, Lori, if you wouldn't mind me volunteering you to provide an update, maybe at the next meeting, after you've had a chance to join. Oh.
Yeah, happy to, Dave.
Okay. All right.
And is it Kieran? Are you on working group 1?
Yes, and so working group 1 is both transparency and copyright. There is a second draft that is currently open for comment, but the deadline is tomorrow noon, European time. So there is a meeting this evening. I think it's at 5 p.m. Brussels, Central European time, and it's a 90-minute meeting, and some people have applied to be able to make an oral presentation. So, for example, Open Source Initiative will have 3 minutes to give input there, although most of the people providing input, we expect they will be from the content side. So there's a lot. Basically, there's a lot of issues to discuss. There are 500 people in the working group, and it's difficult to know how to have an influence on this. But there is a draft that's available for comment until tomorrow, and I would expect a third draft then to be available in February for comment. There's a hard deadline for finishing the code of practice. I don't have it off the top of my head. I believe it's around the start of May, and that deadline is in the legislation, so it can't be changed. And this code of practice will then be what we have to use until the standards are drafted for the AI Act, which is a process that could take 2.5 years.
And just to expand on that, the deadline is May 2nd. And substantively, the document is focused on GPAI, general purpose AI. So there's a section on transparency. They have a nice table in there that articulates the specific requirements of what to include in transparency documentation. And then there's 3 additional sections that outline for GPAI with systemic risks. What do you have to do in terms of risk management and a couple of other areas? So the document is very, actually more detailed than you would think, outlining some very specific requirements to guide us as Clarence said, until we get standards in place. But it doesn't talk about things that are non-GPAI, which is the majority of what is being done today. It's really just going after the high risk GPAI with focus on systemic risks.
And it's my understanding they split the working group one into 2 discussion threads. One is focused on copyright, one is focused on transparency.
So Nick, you put something in the chat on this. And I'll come back to the comments further up in a moment. But you put a document in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. This is just a for reference, so it's not about what's going on in the EU, but I think around transparency, you're seeing a number of initiatives in different jurisdictions, and so I was just sharing with the group the one coming out of California, I think last September or so, which has some language relevant to that transparency discussion. And it's fairly high level, but I think what is interesting is that some of the elements that are articulated in this provision may be relevant in other contexts. So I think if a jurisdiction starts thinking about, what kind of transparency measures they want to put in place, they are going to land on something perhaps similar to what California did. Just as an FYI.
And one other activity that's going on that we're Qualcomm's in the loop on is the U.S. NIST working groups. They are working on a voluntary reporting template. Right now, they're talking about it conceptually in terms of what it is and contains, yeah, but that's also evolving in parallel to what the EU and other jurisdictions are doing.
Okay, any other comments on that, on transparency? I think, and maybe we can talk afterwards, but Laurie, Kieran, if you were able to expand on some of the work that's being done at our next session in the transparency discussions, I think that would be helpful, and I think others would appreciate it, but we can talk about that afterwards.
Good.
Yeah, I'm happy to provide more information, but if you have something, if you have questions, then that would help me provide input, because I could talk for a long time on the topic, and I don't want to bore people with details that are interesting for me, but not particularly for everyone in the group.
Whilst we have everyone on the call, I mean, I've got a number of questions, but open it up to others. What are there questions here that we'd like to try and get answered?
I would be interested in Karen's thoughts about, if OFE is taking any positions in particular in these points, that we can look for opportunities for alignment or discussion. That would be appreciated as we go through this.
I would be happy to discuss that, but I also don't want to derail the editing of this document for today. So if I put my email address in the chat, would that be another way to do that?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
So the action is to, or maybe we can just email the mailing list or Kieran directly on any questions that we'd like answered around transparency. I noticed higher up in the chat, Arthur has put, apart from the license, how we encode acceptable uses according to the license into the bill of materials. More and more Rail family licenses are popping up. We will eventually have taxonomy, enum, class of acceptable uses, something similar to attribution, share alike, non-commercial, etc. Do you want to come off mute and just expand on that point?
There's so there's a lot of data set that adopt this kind of so-called responsible AI license, right? And if you follow the link that I just put there, there's examples that yeah that uh about data sets that actually use it, and they put something like for example, like you are allowed to use this data set, but you are not allowed to use this in a way that you're going to harm this and that, right? So this is additional to uh, regular, for example, like open source license that we known of, right? Because like previously, for example, those like attribution share like stuff that I put it there, right? It's something that we already understand, right? And for example, Creative Commons and the OSI, right? Kind of clearly define these classes, and with these classes, you can group license together, right? Whether it's like has a viral characteristic or not, for example, right? But then with these rail like new rail families of license, at the moment, I don't think we have something that or let's say machine readable or this something that can be easily discovered by just like, okay, I want to see all the license that doesn't allow me to use this in a military purpose, for example, right? So I just wonder that's will this effort OpenChain AI working group actually has also interest in this uh, like real family of licenses or not. I have actually have brought this up sometime a while ago to SPDX license data working group, and the general response at the time that they feels like this real license doesn't actually fit into their definition of open source, because they actually like create something that more restrictive, right? And not consider open source. So according to SPDX listed license, they only wants to include the license that consider open source only. So at the moment, if you look at the SPDX listed license, there's none of Rail family licenses. So I just wonder whether the OpenChain AI working group will consider, you know, like, or how to describe this Rail family of licenses. That's yeah, question. Thanks.
Thank you, Arthit, for coming off mute and just expanding on what you said. I mean, comments here, we haven't really captured licenses specifically in here, but open up for discussion.
I think those are good points. I think there's an ongoing conversation as to what is open source, and it's punctuated by, you know, what's going on in the EU AI Act, where, you know, if you qualify as being under, or if as an open source AI or model, I would say, you end up getting favorable treatment relative to some of the more with the evolving compliance requirements. You know, it's clear that there's a position being taken by the OSI, and there's counter positions being taken by others, including Meta. I think that if we keep our focus on streamlining the AI supply chain, however we encounter it, I think we end up needing to embrace, you know, various flavors on the, call it the open source spectrum, all the way to sometimes even what one would consider to be, commercial models. But I think our wheelhouse should be on the open source side, but the supply chain will encompass a variety. And I think we want to have an approach to handling these issues in a consistent way across the board. So I see us as being more successful being agnostic on this particular question, while being aware that there's a bunch of different views that are out there and maybe not quite settled. Those are my thoughts. Others may disagree, open to other views as well.
Could I just get
Yeah, go ahead, Kieran.
another point of view? Is I know the OSI and FSF and the bodies that have been traditionally defining free and open source software, they've always had the position that usage restrictions are not allowed in a free or open source license, and so Meta is asking to allow usage restrictions, but I don't think there's anyone who would suggest moving the responsibility for defining open source from OSI to Meta. And so it's unfortunate that Meta is using the term open source for their work. The recent open source AI definition from OSI might reduce that, but in general, the reason why SPDX, I presume, would not have any option to categorize Rail as being open source is that Rail licenses have usage restrictions, and they usually have a few other restrictions as well. But the usage restrictions are simply incompatible with being free software or open source, and so I think it would be strange if any other body decided to declare Rail licenses as being open source. I think that would be quite controversial and unusual.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. Can I offer another counter opinion to that? It's my thinking that the EU AI contemplates that restrictions are essential in some areas for their view of the AI or the AI industry to be deployable in the European Union. If you just look at, for example, like prohibited AI practices, those are the ones that are coming into force soon. Like those are situations where an AI system could manipulate people's decisions, exploit vulnerabilities, classify people based on social behavior, personal traits, predict people's ability to commit, or likelihood to commit a crime. Those are all going to be restrictions upon use. And if you look at the Rail license, the open Rail license terms, some of those actually have some overlap into what's contemplated by those prohibited practices. So I think that the open source definition doesn't apply one for one, in my opinion, to the AI use case.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
This is actually, I would see, as an argument against the Rails licenses, because the argument has always been that usage restrictions should not be in a license because they should be in a law. So, for example, people had ethical licenses many years ago that said you can't use this software for human rights violations, and of course this isn't very effective because people who openly commit human rights violations probably don't read and care about your license, but also the human rights violations are already illegal. You don't need a software license to do this. And so what the EU AI Act does is it makes certain activities illegal, and that's the correct place for these things to be stopped. They're blocked by putting them into a law rather than asking a software owner to decide what's ethical and what's not ethical, or what's allowed and what's not allowed. And so the more we have these restrictions in laws, the more they're not necessary in a software license. if they were ever necessary. But the having them in a law reduces the argument in favor of allowing them in a license.
Yeah, I hear that. That's a good point. But I would also point out, and by the way, I'm not here to advocate for the position that OpenRail is open source. I'm completely agnostic on this question. But I would point out that OpenRail came out before the EU AI Act. So in a space where the practice is evolving faster than legislation, I do understand why a company may want to have restrictions in there, to preempt certain use cases as reflecting poorly on that company and their product. But thank you for this conversation. I appreciate it. It's an interesting one.
I think Rowan chipped in the chat about rare licenses are similar to ethical FOSS licenses. I guess we touched on that as well. Rowan also talks about stability. AI also used the term in a controversial way.
It's not about Meta using it. No, I guess in terms of stuff in the chat, the only thing that I wanted to point to was for this section in talking about licenses, I guess there's a sense in which if there are licenses, then you can point to them. If there are no licenses, then there's an implication that the person who's distributing it didn't think one was necessary, or possibly that there's a transparency statement being made somewhere about the material, but that they felt that a license wasn't necessary. So maybe giving responsibility to point to transparency statements that have been made about a particular data set in relation to a model trained on it, or even just noting that I don't have a license for this, but I don't think I need one.
Oops. I don't know. I'll wordsmith that later. But I think I'm getting the gist of we need to have a process in place to maybe review licenses. Some might not be relevant, some might not be in place, some might be required, other areas of transparency might be required. And we should try and weave that in here.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I do, Rowan, since I see that you're affiliated with Oxford, I don't know if you happen to know, but I understand that the UK is going towards a position of more liberal use of training data sets.
Yeah.
Is that what's informing your comment?
Well, not necessarily, no. And I think that, yes, there's all sorts of political reasons for that and economic reasons. But no, it's more really, I suppose that in a document like this, I think remaining silent about elements of what's being distributed and just saying, well, here are the licenses that I could gather about because I obtained these things under these licenses. At the moment, this section as written, I think you could feel that you were abiding by what the document is intending you to do by saying, well, here are the licenses I've been told about, and so here I'm telling you about them too. I just wonder whether it needs to be slightly broader than that in that and here are things which I don't feel require a license, and here are things which maybe don't require a license, but where I'm aware that, for example, a model which has been trained with this data was distributed in a state that demands transparency statements, and therefore a transparency statement has been made about this particular model. That all of those things would be useful for downstream receivers of the system. And if you've got those things in your own personal set of knowledge or your company's knowledge, that's the kind of thing you ought to be passing along.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Let me just see how many of the sections we have. I think it's just 3 of the sections. Were there any further comments on transparency? I'm aware we just have about 15 minutes to go. Hearing none. Of course, we've got next month that we can come back to this when we do a slightly deeper dive into transparency. We talk about access here, maintain a process to effectively respond to external AI compliance inquiries. The comment before was that we should probably take out some of the wording from the licensing ISO standard around how we do this. But I've kind of just genericized it by just saying a published contact email address, rather than it being stored in a Linux Foundation repository, for example.
Matthew, I agree with what you just said, that at some point, we should do a close scrub, against the, 42001. There's a couple other sections that have overlap, for example, like the AI policy, there's a bunch of other, sort of things, so that, our piece, is a supply chain optimization that works with 42001.
Okay. Let me just capture that as a comment.
As we know that 42001 doesn't cover all of the EU AI Act requirements, is there a desire to take a look at those at a macro level and consider those here?
And I can't remember if we touched on this in a previous session, but maybe I'd like people's thoughts on it. We could always capture things that are EU specific or US specific, or certain jurisdiction specific, and we can make it optional to those who are not working, distributing, or selling or licensing things in that jurisdiction.
Yeah, we probably will find that 42001 will be updated over time to address the additional requirements of those jurisdictions. So perhaps it'll take care of itself.
Mm-hmm. It might actually be Sensenelec that writes those EU AI Act items. But you raise a good question, Lori, which is, we're familiar with the AI Act because it's the most complete legislation out there for AI. How much do we risk overfitting? Because we're all sort of like, looking at that as well in the context of this. When Brazil comes out with their promised AI legislation, when other countries, have more robust frameworks, how much do we want to adjust? Maybe I would offer, though, that maybe we look at the EU Act as just a reference, but not try to overfit.
Is this document intended to comply with all of the 42001 requirements?
Yeah. The way I would think of it, and I'm open to other views, but the way that I was thinking about it was, we have, OpenChain has a relationship with ISO, and we've got two specifications that already, recognize standards there. ISO already has the 42001, and for us to do our work relative to building trust in the supply chain, for that, we should find a way to be more modular on top of 42001. And for that, we can use some principles that seem to be reflected, and informed by some of the legislation, but I don't think we should, intend our output to necessarily fit any particular one legislative framework.
Thank you, that's helpful.
I agree with Dave, but also the practical aspect of trying to keep up and modify this with legislation that's coming out may make it more challenging. So if just from a practical stance, we can also make it jurisdiction agnostic, then it's hopefully going to live a bit longer.
Maybe just saying at a macro level somewhere that, part of your program should be compliant with the specific regulations and practices within your applicable jurisdiction would cover it.
Sorry, who was talking there? Was that Karen, Laurie?
Lori.
Yeah.
Well, I guess going along with that, noting exactly what that jurisdiction is so people know where they're straying outside it and need to do extra work.
You know what could be interesting from a value chain perspective, if you have different parties who have different requirements, and then downstream people have additional requirements that can't be satisfied by the upstream parties because they don't have those. How do you address those gaps? When downstream you don't have the information to address those gaps.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the situation I'm afraid of.
Yeah, so it's almost like I don't want to get too detailed, but there could be a concept there of the upstream people, when they produce their documentation, identify which jurisdictions are applicable. They've addressed in their artifacts. Then the downstream people will know what's there and not there, can use that to inform their use of that software or data set.
Right. Effectively resourced. So again, this is taken from ISO 5230. I think this is fairly straightforward, that a program is effectively resourced. There's enough legal expertise and you can resolve problems. A program task is done in sufficient amount of time. I think this is just good business and good housekeeping. If I don't mind, just in the last few minutes, it was this section that may spark a more of a debate. I tidied it up a little bit. We talked about last time, having a process to review AI context and have an approvals process. There should also be a process for tracking new regulations and informing those in a project of any additional compliance. I'm sensing the last comment that was just made about regulations, maybe we take this out and sort of have a small section on regulations and keeping things up to date, because I also feel the sentence is probably slightly out of place compared with the rest 8.1. But we talked about AI bill of materials, and I guess we've flip-flopped over the last year of, do we capture fields in here? And I think the growing consensus was no, we should create and manage AI bill of materials, and those fields could be in any format like Cyclone DX, SPDX, or other format. And then we kind of left these in. I changed the word slightly, so fields may include like model detail, the model details may include license, etc. And again, we've got the same with data sets, training and testing and validation sets. It says here, or it said in one of the notes, that we should maybe just use examples, and that could be in the form of guidance documentation that goes alongside this. But I'd just like to open this up for further discussion about maybe either removing this or kind of how we want to get across that we don't want to recreate another format, and we want to advise those that we should either use an industry standard or another agreed format between two parties.
Can I ask a stupid question, which is what do we mean by AI content here? Do we mean content produced by the AI or potentially produced? Obviously, that's too large, really. So, or the content within a package that's distributed, or specifically content upon which a model has been trained?
Apologies for maybe not being clear. My interpretation, and if I said this incorrect, AI content, I think this is AI bill of material content.
Okay,
so it seems like training data set.
So everything, the system, the model, and the training data.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it's not like the output of an AI.
No, sure.
system.
No, I didn't think it could be, but I just wanted to make sure.
thoughts, suggestions, stripping out things like the proposed fields?
Yeah, this is an area that's going to be really tricky and evolving, I think. So if you look at different, like, model cards, it's going to be more than that. And even with model cards, there's a lot of variation. Yeah, since we're trying to create, a standard that has some feature proofing, being too specific, I think, on these fields, I think limits the applicability.
And any other comments here? Are we comfortable removing this?
Yeah, I agree.
Good. I'm happy to tidy these up and make the suggestions. There's this one. Considering moving. Oh, yeah. Okay. So this was an aid memoir for me to bring this topic up. So the last one, testing results. A process exists to examine the testing results to determine whether it is suitable for the organization. We need to define what testing results are, but I recall a conversation earlier in the year around the outputs of AI system tests. Was that right? And we want to verify that they're suitable. I don't know if anyone else can remember talking about testing results.
So is that in the context of compliance or in the context of performance and functionality? I guess I don't think I was at the meeting in question. Sorry, so I can't really be helped.
We've never really talked about the latter there, about the performance. It's always been around compliance. So I infer that.
Okay, yeah, no, fair enough. Because things like the model openness framework talk about sharing the results of things like performance and functionality testing, but
Right. There's performance and there's safety testing. And you can see how both would be relevant, to be provided by people upstream to, for evaluation by people downstream.
Can I comment? Because this 8.2 is a subsection of 8, which is about AI content review and approval, it would suggest to me as a reader that the testing results are to do with approval. And so that could be safety, if there are safety requirements for compliance, or basically any other. It'd be more focused on compliance than performance, just because of the section that it's part of. And so if that's not the intended meaning, then maybe it should be clarified.
I'm happy to clarify that this is around compliance. I'd like to think that we're all in agreement on that. It's what we specifically meant at the time we decided to write that.
We might be able to punt on this one. Sorry, punt is it's a U.S. metaphor for American football. But we might be able to take a shortcut on this one, because 4201 has a section 8. They have a pretty robust discussion of addressing risk and impact assessments. And I think implicit in that is going to be like an evaluation process that would include testing. So when we can maybe just make a note that this may be superseded. This section may be superseded by 4201.
Just another FYI, there is a new, well, it's not so new, but there's an insurance profile in SPDX that will be forthcoming. So it actually spells out what you have to do to comply. So maybe it would be something that this document should refer to as soon as that comes out. But Matthew, the individual is Nicole. I can send you her details if that's of interest.
Thank you.
Karen, can you say a little bit more about that particular piece? The assurance specification, is it or sorry, the profile, is that a layer on top? How does that interact?
Yeah, it's a layer on top. It's the idea of being able to document the evidence that you comply. So, test plans, a structure for that. I'm trying to think of all the different details. I've just recently joined this group, so I'm probably not the expert, but I'm sure Nicole or some of the members would love to come in and talk to this group about what they're planning to put out. They were targeting to release in 3.1 for SPDX, so I don't know if their plans are still to do that or not, but it might be later than when you get this document approved, but it could be something you allude to because it is being developed in the open.
Thank you. Yeah, that's interesting.
How about I post a little bit about it in the chat line, and then I'll give you details to get Nicole or others to come. I mean, if anybody's going to FOSDEN, she's giving a couple of talks there as well.
That's great.
Awesome.
Thanks, Karen.
Hey, Matthew, I see that Brian's joined.
Excellent.
Yeah, I can do an intro for Brian when he's ready. Yeah. Hey, Brian, welcome.
Hello. How's everybody doing?
Good, thanks.
Good.
Is my screen still sharing? Yes, there it is. I think we're all pretty much here there. Dave, I'm happy to end this part of the call and move on to the next part.
Okay. Okay, that sounds great. Hey, Brian, I took your bio, your brief, bio from the Linux Foundation presentation. If I can just read that out, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
All right, cool. Thank you. All right, so welcome our guest speaker, Brian Warner. Brian's the architect of the Fidelity Investments OSPO. He is responsible for setting internal open source policies and standards, identifying improvements to the open source contribution and consumption experience, architecting tools that improve Fidelity's engagement with open source, and streamlining the developer experience. He works closely with Fidelity's development, legal, audit, and compliance teams to ensure Fidelity is a good citizen within the open source community. And this started, this talk's, idea for this talk, to be repeated is, based on an opportunity that Matthew, Shane, and I had in Napa at the Open Source Summit to hear Brian speak, and it just seemed like his content is very well suited, the discussion that we were having here within this work group. So welcome, Brian, if I can turn it over to you.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Hey, everybody. So I am going to apologize because I have somewhat of a canned talk here because it's one of what's been approved by external comms. But this is a recap of a talk which I gave at both Finos event as well as Linux Foundation Member Summit, and that's where Dave and I had connected on this. The gist of this, I'll pull up the slides here in a second, but I mean, I will also talk around the talk a little bit. The gist of this is that we had kind of some surprises when we started getting requests from engineers at Fidelity to start using LLMs in particular. The challenges really were at a very high level. One, licenses are different. course, I think we're all fairly aware of that. Second thing is that understanding the licenses that actually apply to the piece of software that you're trying to use is a challenge. And it turns out that it probably mirrors the early days of SCA tools in the open source space and uncovering what dependencies and what open source licenses apply to a piece of software fairly, there's a fairly strong analogy there to that time. So with that, I'm going to pull up my slides here. And feel free to interrupt me at any time, by the way. I'm certainly happy for this to be a conversation as opposed to me just presenting out to you. So basically, this talk, again, I mentioned that I'd given this at Finos. I developed this with one of our legal counsel here at Fidelity, Tanya Corsi. She's not on the call with us today. I am not legal counsel. I am in the OSPO, so just heads up on that. But Tanya and I work together very closely on a lot of things related to licensing, in particular, figuring out what we needed to figure out about LLMs. So. The main thing, I'm sure I'm not the only one here who would say that there were some licensing surprises when requests to start using LLMs started coming through. First, mainly because there's no shortage of LLMs that claim to be open source, but in reality have some wonky license, like the responsible AI licenses, for example. Things that aren't even remotely close to the open source definition of source code license, not taking into account the AI definition at this present time, but just in general, open source definition, because that's what we used as the benchmark for determining whether a license was open source and within the scope of the OSPO or source available and required additional review. Second thing is that licenses on LLMs do work differently from what we're accustomed to in open source. Latent licenses and license errors are much harder to detect. So, the core of this talk really is about how we at Fidelity got comfortable with how the licensing is different and what's working for us currently in production. So 3 main things to cover today. First, establishing the baseline on our internal opinion on how we think that licenses have changed. We'll also talk about how LLMs break some of the usual assumptions about how license compliance should work. And then I'll tell you a little bit about how we've adapted. And again, I'm happy to take questions in line or at the end. So again, disclaimer, this is a discussion of what's working for us. We're not giving you advice. I'm in no capacity to give you advice, and this is something that your mileage may vary substantially. So setting a baseline, assume that I'm probably not the only person here from a regulated firm. If you're from a regulated firm, then you're probably familiar with auditable standards. And basically, for those who haven't worked in a regulated industry, standards are rules that we set for ourselves that we then develop processes and controls around to make sure that our actions are consistent with what we say that we're going to do. At Fidelity, open source is a standards governed process. And we have an enterprise level open source software standard that says, among other things, when someone wants to use open source or source available software, we have to figure out what licenses apply. It also says that once those licenses are identified, the OSPO is responsible for evaluating them and then also understanding how we're going to comply with them. And with regular open source, this is fairly easy to understand. Setting aside the text of the license for a second, the process of actually figuring out which license applies is pretty well understood. Given a chunk of source code, you can diff it and hash it. As long as somebody has a knowledge base of diffs and hashes from known open source projects, you can figure out where it came from and what licenses apply to that code. So, taken together, the effective license on a piece of source code is going to be the union of all the licenses that you found. And that's, a fairly simplified description of the process, but the key thing here is it's deterministic. And the good news with that is that you can literally buy tools that solve it using money that figure this out for you. And this is a fairly well-established business among the SCA vendors. Where things get a little bit more complicated is license text evaluation. This is harder to get off the shelf because it's fundamentally evaluation of a legal document. So my company's interpretation of a given license could very well be very different from what your company interprets. But for the most part, the most common open source licenses are well written and fairly consistently interpreted. And the good news is this is another problem that you can handle essentially with money, basically with counsel. But with open source licenses, this process is easier in large part because of the OSD. I know that everybody on this firm or everybody in this call is familiar with the OSD, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going through what it is. But that just to kind of recap in plain language, the reason that we like the OSD is that it makes it really easy to use open source software because licenses behave predictably. Going back to that auditable enterprise standard, the reason that we worry about this at a regulated firm is that when things behave predictably, it's easier to develop processes around them and meet your own requirements. So that's kind of the core of why this is something which is so near and dear to what we care about on the policy setting side. So if you've paid attention to the license discussions around LLMs, and I assume that you have, you know that a lot of the kind of traditional parts of the OSD get thrown out the window. We now have some new things that keep us awake at night. So things like usage restrictions. You can't use this software to improve somebody else's software. Or if you have more than 5 1/3 monthly active users, you need to buy a license. Or straight up, you can't use this for any commercial purpose. There are also the responsible AI licenses or Rails, which enumerate long lists of things that you can and can't do, disclosures you have to make. And sometimes, we've found some that require you to bind your own users to the terms of somebody else's license. And we've long had nonsense hanging around the periphery of licensing, but these new licenses do tend to be even more restrictive, and they complicate things a little more. We found some that have changed. They can change and they do change at any time, sometimes without notice. Now, getting into the kind of specifics of this domain, we did find that's just the tip of the iceberg. Conceptually, we in general, and specifically myself, use the term AI model pretty loosely. There are a lot of prerequisites for an LLM before it actually becomes usable. It starts with an untrained model, which is generally a pretty compact piece of source code, often released under a real open source license. But then you have to consider the initial training data that teaches the model something useful, like what written English looks like. You may have other data sets that help a model understand not just what English is, but how specific topics relate to each other, or programs that quiz the model and teach it whether an answer was good or bad. And all these things come together to produce what we call internally pre-trained models. The reality is, users rarely care about that nice, pure, innocent, untrained model. The only thing anybody cares about really are pre-trained models. And the challenge is that each of these things that go into a pre-trained model could attach one or more licenses. And because it usually all gets packed together into a single set of related binaries, licensing gets complicated. So that sets up the problem that kind of led to this talk. Our licensing world, which we once thought was complicated, was actually maybe pretty simple by comparison. And so we, as policy setters, myself sitting in the OSPO, I can't just say, no, the licensing is too hard if somebody wants to use one of these things. And, I'm not doing my job right if I pretend that the licensing is just going to take care of itself and shake out in the end. So, the question is, what do we do about these new licenses and how do we figure out what we're allowed and obligated to do? So again, I'll take you through what we're seeing here at Fidelity. Talk first about how we're deciphering these new licenses. When we talk about open source licenses, we're talking fundamentally about things that regulate source code. It's a copyright license that sometimes veers into patents. With LLMs, we are running into a variety of other license types and styles, including data and content licenses and acceptable use policies and EULAs. So first observation coming out of this is that despite the fact that these things are not capital O open source, it's worked well for us to govern them as though they are. Different companies are going to handle this in different ways, but again, going back to that internal auditable open source standard, we handle this by having the same people analyze every license that comes our way, and then determining what we can or can't do without splitting hairs, whether it's OSI approved or a source available license or a rail or whatever. We're trying to make sure that the left hand understands what the right hand is doing. And this has worked out pretty well for us. Just kind of a glimpse into what our license evaluation process looks like. Prior to adapting our process for LLMs, whenever I read a license that we hadn't seen before, I took it through a list of about 20 yes or no questions that look for things like, is the license OSI approved? Do we need to update our documentation to include copyright attributions in the text of the license? Do we need to provide a written offer? Does the license permit dynamic linking? Does network access count as distribution? And this helped me categorize the licenses. And we prefer the OSI approved licenses because, things like you can't have usage restrictions make them much easier to use. And to be clear, this list is going to be different for every company. We kind of expand it and we change it as we read more licenses and discover there are more questions that we need to ask. And that's what happened when we started reading some of these, licenses which are very specific to LLMs. Examples of things that we had to add are, one, is there a non-commercial restriction and does it apply to us? Do we need to update our public-facing terms of service to use this? Are there specific tasks that we can't ask the model to do? Looking for things like user caps or disclosure requirements, like this content was machine generated. One of the more difficult ones for us to get our heads around were, does this license survive fine tuning? There have been a number of talks on this over the years, so I won't get into that here, but this helped us put together a categorization. And the single biggest learning from this process is that it was worth the time to create a license data structure that would, have yes or no answers to certain things that would allow us to characterize what this thing looks like. And at this point, I've read enough of these licenses that I'm not going to remember any details of something that I've read, months ago. And so at Fidelity, what we ended up doing is building this into our architecture management tool. So at any point, I can query of the licenses that we've seen and categorized, which licenses use a network definition of distribution, which licenses require a written offer, which licenses require us to update terms of use, that sort of thing. So getting our arms around that organization and actually beginning to categorize these licenses, which are not open source but very similar to, really, that helped us a lot in terms of just getting our feet underneath us. Nice thing about licenses is they generally don't change from one piece of software uses them to another. Once you've identified the characteristics of the license, you can then make the call if and where you're comfortable using the software that carries it. Like, for example, at Fidelity, all these yes or no questions that we ask about these different licenses, they culminate in a fairly concise grid of red, yellow, green stoplights that say, whether the license is cleared for internal use, public-facing infrastructure, distribution to third parties, etc. For LLMs, I've added a couple more stoplights that say who can prompt and who can use the outputs of a model based upon how the license reads. But the main advantage of this is that legal and I put a lot of sweat into understanding and categorizing these licenses. I don't expect engineers to do the same, and in fact, I don't want them to, because there is a chance that they would come to a different conclusion that may be incorrect. Again, auditable standards, consistency is really important to us. The summary at the end is, really all that's available to all engineers internally through our architecture portal, and it's worked well because most people actually don't really want to read licenses. They just want to know what they need to know and then move on with their day. So, this is how we've adapted our internal license practice to accommodate some of the things that we started to see. The other major observation that I'll offer is that knowing what the license says is one thing, but figuring out how many licenses apply involves a bunch of new work. So, at its core, licensing is a matter of answering three questions. What license was declared? What undeclared license was inherited from other works? And then what exactly do we need to do about that? And none of this should sound new because we've had to ask these questions for years. Like if you're distributing software, you should already know that some open source licenses are incompatible with each other. This just adds some new dimensions to it. Historically, if you had a well-configured SCA tool, it is fairly easy to figure out which licenses apply to a given piece of open source software. Kind of like I mentioned earlier, you have diffable and hashable source code, and you can figure out the license on a project, or if someone copied and pasted code from another project, based upon the source code that you find in a text file. There are vendors that have comprehensive knowledge bases that map these projects back to their licenses. If you combine this with the fact that we've got the structured evaluation of these licenses, we now have a comprehensive understanding of where and how you can use a piece of source code. It's fundamentally a horizontally shaped problem. Assuming that licenses are correctly declared and identified, you're going to be checking a specific version of code, which has specific dependencies, which carry specific licenses, which you're either comfortable with or not. Again, the outcome of that work that I was just describing for the past 10 minutes, assuming the license info is correct, you really don't care about past versions, just the version that you're distributing. It's fairly straightforward. LLMs tossed a wrench into this. Remember how I said earlier, the only thing that anybody really cares about are the pre-trained models. Well, weights, or this process training data, are the reason that pre-trained LLMs are so large. They're basically massive arrays of numbers that we can't really explain, and which get reshuffled every time you retrain the model, and they do so in unpredictable ways. We can obviously detect when the weights have changed in a model. Like, that's pretty easy. You just look for different numbers. And if someone has a knowledge base mapping published versions of these weights against that model, you can tell when you're seeing something that's already been seen before. But to date, I've not yet seen anything that can credibly and programmatically predict how a pre-trained model is going to change when it gets retrained from one state to another. Due to the nature of the training process, you can run the same training operation twice and get radically different results. In other words, SCA on newly trained LLMs just fails, or something which you're attempting to train internally. So in essence, we're kind of back to the bad old days of open source person, presenting on a call complaining about binary distributions. But the difference is that this time we don't have the ability to reliably decompile them. So creates a bit of a challenge here. So where this is a problem, if you're using an LLM from a site that allows user uploaded models, things can get a little complicated. Models can go through any number of revisions before being published on someone's account. There's one specific site which I'm thinking of, which shouldn't be much of a stretch to figure out. They can involve any number of training data sets from literally anywhere, can include input from other models, and these things can alter the model any number of times. And when this happens, there's no paper trail. The weights get reshuffled, meaning we can't deterministically say, this state led to that state, which led then to this other state. And there have been some excellent talks over the years about the relationship between open source licenses and weights. But without getting into those weeds, I'll just note that some things that exist in the hierarchy of components that lead to a final model do have license obligations that survive fine tuning. In the end, the license declaration in an LLM's model card will always and only come from the user who uploaded the model. If the person who uploaded the model was sloppy about determining which licenses apply to their model, or misinformed, or even malicious, you really have no way to tell if the license declaration in that model is complete or correct. It doesn't take much time to find models that are listed as MIT or CC by SA, when from the description, they're clearly fine-tuned from far more restrictive commercial-based models. This is, maybe the fourth time I've said this, but it really matters when models and data sets don't use licenses that meet the traditional OSI definition. Some of the licenses that you can find explicitly forbid improving other models. Some data sets prohibit their use for training. Some of them explicitly state you cannot use them in a commercial context and specify that their provisions carry forward through generations of fine tuning. And if you remember, I said identifying licenses on source code is a horizontally shaped problem. Now we have another dimension, which is how licenses can have characteristics that can credibly carry forward through different generations, as well as another dimension, what other software you can use that model with. The bad news for the foreseeable future is that determining license obligations does, it requires some manual intervention. Figuring out, what's the LLM's list of ingredients, and second, figuring out what licenses those ingredients drag into the mix. The best thing that we did here so far, the thing that's worked for Fidelity is, treating these models as we would a family tree. So, like, how do you figure this out? If you've ever built a family tree, you'll know it's not it can be an error-prone process. It involves going to family members and asking how far back do you remember. Then you go ask some other people the same, and you cross-check with some others. But basically, you work your way backwards one generation at a time until you run into a gorilla or run out of living relatives. And you can often do the same with LLMs. Sometimes you can tell from the model cards where they say, my model was fine-tuned from this other base model. And when you go to the base model, it says this model was trained on these 3 data sets, and here's a link to the untrained model. And once you find those ancestors, you can determine if the license is going to survive fine-tuning and if it applies to the thing that you ultimately want to use. What you're doing is you're building up a list of licenses that you think govern your current version of the current LLM, and then you can figure out from there, work backwards to figure out what your obligations are. Sounds like a lot of work, and it is. One of the things that we found, though, is that there really are only a handful of foundational trained models out there. It's not a perfect assumption because models do change, but for the most part, once you figured out the ancestry of like Google's T5 large model, you don't need to repeat that analysis when you find another model that's fine-tuned from that same one. You just need to link the two together. So within Fidelity, we have an architecture tool that allows us to designate predecessor and successor relationships between pieces of software. When I find something new, if I can trace it back to something, trace back in the lineage through the family tree of this model, back to something that I've already seen, I just link the two together. And this has worked out pretty well. We've got a tool which dynamically calculates the license obligations on a given LLM based upon the licenses that we can identify. And we've been using this process for the past 9 months or so, and I can tell you firsthand, it has a high warm-up cost. There's a fair amount of sleuthing that goes into this. But we went into it assuming there wouldn't be that many new models, and it turns out that assumption did hold pretty well. So pulling all of this together, we've come a long way from scan the source code and match the hash to an upstream project. While SCA is still absolutely table stakes for an open source compliance program, LLMs have forced us to evolve the way that we look at this. First we had to get really organized about how we review and classify licenses, as the new so-called open licenses can actually be quite invasive. Second, the shape of compliance has changed from being a lateral, what are the licenses on these specific versions of software that I'm building into my application, to a multidimensional, what non-obvious licenses in the history of my software have some impact on what I can do with the derivatives. It's an interesting time, and the irony is that I'm doing this. There's a lot of manual work to uncover what these family trees are, but an LLM would be well suited for doing this work. So that's it's gonna be an interesting place to watch. I think there's a lot of opportunity for some exciting tools in this space. So I will leave it right there and open it up for questions. That's the talk that we gave.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate that. And that I think that talk's very well taken. I expect that the experience that people have here are going to vary pretty much across the board. But I would venture to say that your thought process here is certainly on the advanced side of the process maturity spectrum. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of what are the parameters that you're thinking are more important to be thinking about relative to the structure when you're talking about organizing the metadata for LLMs? Which ones do you think have the most payoff or the best payoff, for efficiency purposes? When you're looking at, let's say, a recursive scenario when you're seeing similar LLMs come across the pike.
Yeah, good question. So the things that I track, so kind of maybe to provide a little context in the way that we evaluate these things. I am looking at things purely from a license perspective. And this is very similar to the way that I handle open source licenses for traditional source code. I'm looking at, based upon the strict reading of the text, is this something we can use, which is different from the question which gets asked, based upon what this thing does, is it something we should use? Based upon the data sets this has been trained on, is this something that we're comfortable with the content, et cetera? Those are all questions which are asked by other teams. So I'm going to scope my answer very specifically to licenses. The main things that we're looking for in licenses are, is there something about this license that restricts what you can or can't do? And is it something that in the the actual text of the license, it says you can't use this to interact with another model, for example. Can't use this thing for reinforcement learning, or does it say, you can't use this for commercial context or whatever? We are essentially looking for licenses someplace in the history that have like these types of obligations paired with something that indicates that this carries forward through different generations. I had kind of alluded to some of the discussions earlier, other conference talks that have been given over the past few years about whether licenses attached to weights can survive fine tuning. For example, like if you do a copyright license, pure copyright license on something which is numerical in nature, whether that's something that can even apply. I'm not going to touch that particular question, but what we are looking for are things which we would reasonably believe, say, through multiple generations, this is a license which is going to carry forward through the generations of the family tree. At that point, then what we're looking for are, really kind of the union of characteristics here. Are there things that we just don't like in the final, in what we calculate the final version of this license, kind of composite license on this piece of software to be? Does it require us to do things like, put additional restrictions on a user of this thing? Does it require, certain compliance actions that we just don't like to do? Right. That's ultimately what we're really trying to get at. What we may find, Dave, is that in some cases, there may be a prior generation of a model that, looking back down through this pyramid, a prior generation of the model where everything up until that point had a license that was fine, that we really liked. But then somebody published a new version or a fine tuning of this that, maybe used a different model that has some of these other obligations which we're not comfortable with. And then we say you can use it up to that point, but any derivative of it past that point has been now tainted by something else, somebody else's license that we don't like. So that's kind of that's what we're ultimately trying to get to, is just how long are we comfortable with this before we hit something that we're not comfortable with, and at that point being able to communicate it out to others, saying this version of this particular model is something which is just not good anymore.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Brian. Let me pause to see if anybody else has questions before I continue with any additional ones that I have. Okay. Anyone else, please feel free to jump in. So Brian, some of the comments you just shared, it makes me think about, like, am I tracking the right sets of internal metadata? For example, one thought process that we're thinking about is the internal metadata, or the internal parameters that we're capturing, let's say on the ingest side. Can that be basically formed into a large set, and then ultimately for the subset of those use cases that are going to be distributed, do we pare down from sort of that large internal set, right? So the internal set might be like some of the things that you say, you can only use this model up to this point. You can't up rev it to anything new. Because we don't think it's quite hygienic enough, and then that information, if we end up distributing that, we may not necessarily want to say it in just that way, right? And so it would be the external consumption within supply chain. It'd be sort of a more matter-of-fact version of some of those fields, right? For efficiency purposes.
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the. Oh, go ahead, Dave. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, is that built into your architectural design? Is that your thinking as well?
Well, our thinking right now is for internal use anyhow, entirely. So, we are primarily interested in understanding, like, if we're going to kick the tires on something, what is it okay to kick the tires on? Which, probably different consideration from model producers. I do think there are aspects of this which would be potentially useful if you're looking at, for example, passing a model or information about a model from a producer to a consumer, in the sense that what we're trying to deal with here is we're trying to uncover facts. Like the hardest part of this is not reading the license. The hardest part of this is figuring out what the lineage is of a particular model. And for the most part, if I take a look at something and it says it was fine-tuned from this particular base model, and you look at something and say it was fine-tuned from that particular base model, we've done the same work. And it is actually something that we would, in general, be interested in, being able to find, from somebody who's producing a model, whether they're publishing it, on one of the public sites or not, being able to uncover, what they think the lineage of their model is, because it makes it a little easier for us to figure out whether we're comfortable with that. Separating that from the license evaluation, once you've told me these 5 licenses apply to this particular thing, I can then go work with my, legal team to figure out, are we comfortable with those or not? Just as any other consumer would need to do the same thing. Gets us back into the realm of, or closer to the realm of open source license compliance, where somebody says these are the licenses, or these are the components, these are the licenses that are on them, and then I can have an opinion about those. And that's what we're trying to get to ultimately here, is trying to make this into more of a problem that looks like traditional open source license compliance, as opposed to something where we're having to react to each individual one that we see completely from scratch.
Yeah. And do you feel like, in terms of the internal process, the way that I would plan to deploy it, based on if I had the insight, at the outset, to structure the parameters the way that you described, I would have to trust that the internal teams would, have the right, gates or the check-in processes to query about those parameters, so that, their use case is going to be, or their implementation is going to be consistent with the restrictions that were put in place at the outset. And so you feel pretty good about that in terms of, adherence with that, right?
Yeah, I mean that, so a lot of it, one of the challenges that we've got right now, I think in general, is that the tools just haven't quite caught up with the technology. It's fairly easy to go buy off-the-shelf SCA tools for traditional source code. One of the challenges we ran into specifically with Hugging Face is that SCA tools don't pick up the models that you're pulling in, because they get pulled in at runtime. You can detect, for example, that certain libraries are being used by your Python applications, but the purpose of those libraries is to side load the actual binaries that constitute the model. So, it creates a lot of kind of strange situations where now you have to go do some manual checks, and you do have to do a bit of sleuthing, because the traditional automated tools just don't quite cut it.
Yeah. And I think that the problem is compounded, as you described, with containers. It's even harder to see what's going on.
It is. And, one of the things that we're finding we're finding a lot of value in sites or providers that are able to say, we will provide access to users to these named models, and then telling everybody this is the way that you use these models. It'll get smoother over time, and it certainly looks better than it did a year ago. But that is the fundamental challenge. These are used and consumed in different ways that are not really contemplated by the tools that we had 2 years ago.
Yeah, totally agree. Any other questions for Brian? Well, Brian, thank you very much for this this presentation. I think you provided a lot of food for thought for people. So, again, all of this is this is 3 times for you presenting this. It's new material for most folks here. So, I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And I also hope, Brian, open, invitation to continue to join us at any point, for this working team, so be great to have you as well.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks. I think that that we've completed our agenda for today. Unless Matthew, you want to go back to the document, I feel like this might be a good jumping off point for us.
I'm more than happy to fill in the last 20 minutes if we wish. Let me just bring it up again. And thank you, Brian, for giving that great talk.
Oh, and Brian, I see that there's a query here. Arhit was wondering if he can get a copy of the slides, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So Dave, I'll send you the slides and you can forward them out. Does that work?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you.
Sounds good. Yeah, no problem.
Actually, I didn't mean to just sort of say, jump to the document unless you wanted to, Matthew. I thought we do a temperature check from the folks on the call to see if they want it back or whether they want to jump back to the document.
Let's do that. Let's open it up for discussion. I'll be honest, I think we had a good conversation earlier on, I think, and I'm more than happy, unless others want to go in the intervening time, to tidy this up between now and then. But happy to call time or happy to spend 20 minutes with anyone who wants to go into that document in more detail.
Yeah, I think we pick it up next time.
Let's do that. Is there any other business then? Hearing none, happy to end the call then. Thank you all for joining, and we'll repeat this session in the Asia-Europe time zone on Thursday, and then we meet again in a month. Thanks, guys. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.